All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the longest running show in the world about data. It's called DM Radio. Yours truly, Eric Kavanagh here. And folks, I'm very excited to have a couple experts on the show today who are plying the trade that I find extremely valuable and is really an undercurrent of innovation in the tech space and has been for, gosh, 25 years, maybe a bit longer. And that is open source. So, we're going to talk about open source advocacy and how important open source is for technology today. Obviously, Linux, old Linus Torvalds, he threw down the gauntlet, I guess, about roughly 30 years ago, I think, to build out an operating system that was open source. Now, I've talked to various people over the years about the impetus for all that, and I'm told it's not exactly what I thought it was, but de facto, it became an alternative for dealing with the criticality of having a functional operating system. One that is not proprietary and thus owned by a particular brand. Think Microsoft with Windows. Linux, in fact, has become the de facto standard for enterprise technology for many years now. For 20 years, Linux has been accepted as the standard foundation. And what does open source mean? Basically, it means the source code is available for review. And typically, what happens in the world of programming is you will write an application in code and then you compile it for a certain operating system like Windows or the Mac OS or Android or Linux or Unix back in the days, for example. And if it's closed source, well, that means that you don't really know, unless you're inside the organization and have access to it, you don't know what the code was. You just know how it's been compiled and what it does. So it's kind of like a cake that you get as the compilation. If you have open source, you know the recipe for the cake. If you don't, then you don't know the recipe. So it's good for lots of different things. It's good for being able to identify errors. Bad code goes away is one of the lines about open source that is pretty common. But there are lots of drawbacks too. You can just understand how if it's open source and you just put it out there, well, why would anyone want to pay you for it? And the short answer is that you see lots and lots of companies do this. Of course, Red Hat became very famous in hardening Linux. So RHEL, I think Red Hat Enterprise Linux is what that stands for. They will go and help you deploy this stuff, help you make sure it stays up and running, watch out for security hacks and patches and so forth. There are lots of reasons why you want a partner doing that. That's typically the business model is you'll have an open source version of something and then a enterprise grade version. So think Confluent with Kafka, for example. There are lots and lots. There's data stacks with Cassandra. This is not a new thing. MongoDB, of course, is another open source database technology. There's lots and lots of open source stuff out there, and it is foundational to how many things work. iPhones, for example, have all sorts of open source technology in them. One of my aha moments, and I'll bring in Max Howell here in just a second from T. We have Timothy Lewis as well. But one of my aha moments was getting on an international flight, I guess probably like 10, 11 years ago, and just sitting in front of the screen where you watch the movies. They were doing an upgrade, and I saw the little Linux character there, and like the code is going past my screen. I'm like, oh, okay, so they're using Linux as the operating system for the in-flight entertainment system. It's great if you can use these open source tools, but who pays the open source developers? That's the key. And if you have a project that's important and it's underpinned by one person and that person decides they don't want to deal with it anymore, that's a problem. And we've actually seen that problem play out. So with that long-winded explanation, I'll bring in Max Howell from it's TEA.xyz online. And these folks are trying to build out a model to compensate the open source developers and to really, I guess, infuse some remuneration into the community and some payback for these people to encourage them to keep going. So with all that, Max Howell, welcome to DM Radio. Tell us a bit about T and your mission to bolster open source.
Thank you. Yeah, so I've been in open source for more than 20 years at this point. I didn't think I was going to be a programmer when I was at school, but I did a chemistry degree and I didn't like it. I didn't like it a lot. Um, to the extent that I went home and I installed Linux on my home computer, and Linux at the time was pretty new. Like the idea of open source hadn't really grabbed anyone fully, but while I was playing around with it, I discovered that there was something about open source that really captivated me. So I started building apps and things, but wasn't until like 2009 that I really became like an open source figurehead when I developed this package manager for macOS called Homebrew, which nowadays has got more than 50 million people using it on a day-to-day basis. It's
Hmm.
enormous in its scope and size. It's really one of the biggest open source projects that was ever produced. And on my journey making a homebrew and working on it and finding that I had to spend all my evenings and weekends working on it, and then catching lunch breaks and things. And taking time off, like I took time off from work. I'd save up money and quit in order to work on Homebrew full time because that's what I wanted to do. And I think this is often the case with open source developers is that what they really want to do is build this open source, and the open source they build often becomes like key parts of all modern digital infrastructure, powers the world. And yet, there's something about the open source model that's always made it so that it's unlikely that you're going to be able to get paid for working on it. Like,
Hmm.
we were never the kinds of people who expected to get paid. Uh, like, we did it because it seemed like a fun thing to do, and then it became very important to an awful lot of people, and then we sort of felt half trapped, half like super passionate about what we were doing to the extent that we kept making sure it worked. But there is something awfully wrong with the fact that so much of the world's digital infrastructure nowadays runs on open source, and yet it's very rare that you'll meet someone who can work on open source full time.
Hmm.
They're trading other parts of their lives in order to work on this stuff. And that often leads to issues where, the security of the open source they're working on is like an afterthought, which is not a great thing considering how much of the world runs on this stuff. And as you said, like often these people just rage quit suddenly, and every few months you see a story from someone saying, "Look, I've been begging for these companies. They're often very big companies that build on top of this stuff." To help me to work on this, and I give up. I'm done, and that leaves massive holes in an industry that ever more is in a position where security problems can affect billions of people. So yeah, we've been trying to build out a solution, something new, something different to the existing attempts, and yeah, we're very excited about what we're building.
Yeah, let's kind of dive into that because there are some alternatives. I mean, you're not the first folks to have this idea, but obviously you've got enough experience to know where rubber meets road, and it is important that we maintain these projects. I won't tell which story it was. I'd have to look it up honestly, but there's a story from a webinar I watched a couple of years ago where a very critical component of many enterprise technology stacks was just no longer going to be supported. And there was a guy like feverishly communicating with the developer, say, please, would you just, hand over the project and we'll take it from here. And it was like, nah, leave me alone, go away. And it crashed and burned. And then, it's just like having a part of your car that all of a sudden stops working and you can't replace it. It's like, well, what do you do then? Like, it's a very, very challenging situation. And a lot of people don't realize that these technology stacks for large enterprises are extremely complex. They've spent years in many cases really trying to hammer it out and get it to where it's durable and agile and can do all the things it can do. And you pull a piece out of that thing, it's like a Jenga game, right? Like, oh no, the blocks just start falling. So what are you doing in your approach that you think is going to ensure success?
Yeah, well, we feel that a big part of these withdrawals is, the lack of funding for
Hmm.
people that they would work on these things full time if there was a system that allowed them to do so. Over the years, people have tried to make ways for that to work. Like one of the ways that has emerged over the last few years is the idea of commercial open source, pioneered like by Red Hat probably, like way back.
Hmm.
If you can figure out how to build some kind of service on top of the open source, then you can probably charge companies for that. I think a lot of open source devs don't really want that, is the truth. They want to work on open source in the way that open source works. They don't want to figure out how to bolt on some sort of service model, hire a team, manage a team. They're just builders that want to continue this opportunity to build. So it
Hmm.
doesn't fit for like 95%. And some of those 5% nowadays are like these venture funded kind of models where it's kind of open source, like companies like Superbase and Vercells, like it's kind of open source. I'd even put like stuff like React in there, which, powers a huge number of websites nowadays. Like the
Sure.
the truth is, the companies that are behind these things have agendas, and agenda does not fit into open source in my mind.
Hmm.
Like open source is about building something that solves a problem, and then the community goes, "Yeah, this solves my problem. I like
Yep.
this. I'm going to
Yep.
work with this. I'm going to build this into my stack. I'm going to contribute to this." Open source is weird. This is the reason that nobody's really figured out a way to fund it, and that's
Right.
why our approach is really different. Like we're taking this approach using cryptocurrencies because cryptocurrencies allow you to change the economics of a situation. So we've spent an awful lot of time now, like figuring out how to apply smart contracts on top of open source in order to make it so that the whole system sustains itself in a way that doesn't really change how open source has evolved.
Hmm.
Like it wouldn't be any good at all if we changed how open source works. Like we wouldn't be doing the world a service, and also it probably wouldn't work. Like open source would just go, nah, that doesn't work for us. Like yeah, I'd love to get paid, but like by being paid, you're making it so that actually this is different. So nah, not interested in that. And I'm sure Tim can talk more about how we're going to go about that.
Yeah, Tim, why don't you chime in and let us know? Because again, I see the challenge that you're facing, and I think Max did an excellent job of describing open source developers. They want to build things. They want to build things. Yes, they want to get paid, but mostly they want to build, and they don't want to be hindered or held back in how to build and what to do. And typically you don't like a set of rules being thrown at you, right? You just want to get stuff done. So, what's your take on how tea.xyz can solve for this challenge?
Yeah, so this was a problem now that we've worked on for the last, 3.5 years directly, but it really stemmed from, me getting to know Max. I've been a developer and engineer my whole life. I met Max in 2013. I had just been getting into Bitcoin and Doge and then Ethereum network. Max is an amazing developer. His project at the time was the number one project on GitHub and had been for 3 years.
Hmm.
Yet he had to go from contract to contract in different jobs to support his ability to go work on these platforms. And it took several cycles in the way that crypto evolved to be able to even have conversations with him about where there might be solutions. So I myself, I've worked in the financial industry, had worked in the financial industry for a long time, data expediency and understanding like the underpinnings of fixed protocol data transfer and security. So no stranger to cryptography. I've been using cryptography for 30 plus years. And as these networks have evolved, they're becoming more functional. Max, like many others, I think for a long time, just saw crypto as dog tokens and memes and nothing of any substance. But ideally, we're building out systems that are really this world compute or shared registry type of platforms that people can hopefully ascribe better supply chain security to, for example. But if we attach things like token economic theory on top of these, we believe that you can generate and create real value off of the community values that have already been established within open source. So as Max mentioned, trying not to pervert the way that open source functions and trying not to have any systems that are tit for tat or requiring people to pay token to be able to access open source, but allowing people to be able to be rewarded through a protocol itself. It took us a long time to develop a couple of the different parts. One of the parts that we really have worked on hard is trying to value open source. Not all open source is valuable. It is under our estimations, probably the top 10% of open source has any value.
Hmm.
And so trying to identify what's important and what's used has been very, very difficult because the communities that have evolved are separate. And there's no real way to tell any longer from stars or downloads from GitHub what is actually used. All of those things can
Hmm.
be faked. All those things can be not real, not genuine. So the first thing that we set out to do was create a platform that can really understand the value of open source. We created this protocol called Chai. Really what it does is it attaches to all the different package manager ecosystems and creates a global dependency graph. So really we
Wow.
put different weights on what's depended on by what. And the system package managers have a lot more importance than, say, the language package managers, right? So understanding that history of weight, if your dependency is dependent upon by something that is, truly established and has a larger weight to it, you can rise in what we call T rank. We consider T rank something that's similar to page rank, but for open source dependencies. Based on that T rank, we can distribute rewards from the network itself. So these networks, since they've evolved over the last 15 years, there's an enormous use for the different types of compute that you can have on them, not only from the DeFi-like contracts, but moving into other data availability contracts, moving into other registry contracts, moving into communication gates that we think can be utilized as the user experience gets better for these types of on-chain mechanisms. So I feel like we both felt like a majority of open source developers, hadn't taken a look into these networks. Many of them felt like they got left behind. They didn't participate in the Ethereum launch. They didn't participate in, earlier launches of popular networks. So what we wanted to do is create a network that, one, would marry some of the tools that they might be used to. We created ultimately a layer 2 Ethereum network that has a custom precompile that allows us to use the GPG address space. So going back to GPG PKI, which has been used in Git since 2005, it allows us to not only be able to distribute value to those that have committed to open source over the last 20 years, but also have them use GPG as a part of the PKI to launch contracts and be able to execute commands in the system that's not a far step away from their normal dev UX. So then the network itself, as it gains in popularity and uses, is a permissionless network. And the way that it's structured through the fees that the network generates, a large majority of those fees go directly back into rewarding those that have registered their packages within our platform. We
Yeah,
can
no,
also,
this is really good stuff. Let's put a pin in that. We'll come back in the second segment and dive deeper into this. But I love that you have this dependency model. You understand what's being used, what isn't being used, and you've got a dynamic capacity for ascertaining value and delivering value. So we'll pick this up after the break, folks. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, your host here, Eric Kavanagh, with Timothy Lewis and Max Howell of Tea. That's like the drink, tea, TEA.xyz. But they are building out a rather robust solution to help foster productive open source development and help remunerate the people who build out open source code. Because as we've discussed and as is pretty well known in the industry, building open source technologies does not necessarily pay well. And there are all sorts of strategies around how to make money from that sort of thing. Typically, there is a company that sits on top of an open source project, like Red Hat does with Linux or DataStax does with Cassandra. There are lots of examples, Confluent with Kafka, many examples out there. But at the end of the day, do the developers really get rewarded for what they do? And do we understand the dependencies? And that's what caught my attention, Tim, just a moment ago, as you talked about having this model built of dependencies of different packages and where they are brought together and what those stacks look like and who's dependent on which piece of technology and who runs it. So this model that you built out, it's tracking specific open source projects and where we believe they are deployed. Is that the kind of thing you've got built here?
well, it's tracking all open source from all different package managers that exist. Our goal is to have
Wow.
the 35 plus package managers over the initial launch. Right now, we're covering the top 10 or so to be able to evaluate and create this global dependency graph that we're doing. But ultimately, we're going to be able to reward those that have decided to participate and register or not. We can use signed commits from GPG signatures to reward developers and ecosystems that may or may not want to register their package yet within our ecosystem. Trying to get the messaging to them that they've been rewarded is another issue. Since they had never used that really for any reward distribution prior. But we think we have a unique way of not only identifying the importance of dependencies, but then also making sure that the protocol itself is rewarding those dependencies without grants or bounties. And we will have those sorts of things. We think those sorts of things are important for different aspects. But the general function and use of the network itself and the transactions that occur on the network itself, whomever builds them, whether they're a developer that's utilizing and strong in Web3 on-chain applications, or a developer that published some amazing dependency back in 2007, and is one of those that underpin a lot of the current technology stack, they can be rewarded on our system.
That's very interesting. So it's underpinned by Ethereum. Is that what I'm hearing correctly? So you got a blockchain at the foundation. That's very valuable because blockchain is immutable, and that's the whole idea, is that your code would be registered on the blockchain. Here is the string of text that was deployed, and in this open source project, it's now been packaged up by various people. It's being used around the world. A lot of that information is available, and then you have some capacity to understand the value that's being provided, and you're ideally allocating that according to how much work someone has done and how much people depend on them on their particular piece of code. Because the key is you have to keep things updated, right? I mean, the environment keeps changing, and because the environment keeps changing, you have to keep changing the applications that you're running in these organizations. Needs change, concurrency use goes higher, different things happen, and so you have to be constantly tinkering away with all this stuff. But like, how well built out is this thing so far? Like, what are you able to identify? And I guess, how do you determine the value is a big question.
Yeah, so we've had our Chai algorithm and protocol running for over a year now. We had a test network deployment of that that started last April on the base network. And during that time, we had a large amount of users. We had over 1.7 million uniquely registered wallets, about 610,000 people
Wow.
registered with their GitHub, and over 16,000 packages that were registered. A large amount of that, we've been, attacked, bot attacked, farm attacked. There's anytime you're trying to do something like this, especially on a test network with no financial repercussions, people come at it hard trying to earn rewards. But it taught us a lot of lessons. And so we've come back with some revisions to Chai protocol that we're deploying actually this week, publicly, that we're very excited for, that we think that are going to take care of a lot of the problems that we faced before. And this will be completely, an evolving process. But it's really about reducing spam, reducing the Sybil attacks that go on the value distribution for the network. And again, doing this in public. So we open sourced Chai about 4 months ago. We've had a number of different contributions there, but as it grows, we expect the visibility of that to rise, and we hope that more people will come across and help us figure out better methods to make sure that the weighting and the value that we have for the distribution is more accurate. There's many other kind of problems we're trying to solve, but if we can attack this at the root and understand really the value of the dependencies, then the things on top as well can be solved.
So is the business model where organizations that are using open source software would pay for some kind of license or for access to your system, for example, to be able to gauge the dependencies in their stack and then get help when there are problems? I mean, are those the clients that pay into the pool, which then eventually goes out to the developers? Is that how it works?
So the best part about on-chain and Web3 and these networks, because we've built a blockchain on top of a blockchain, right? So in our blockchain, really the value comes from Metcalfe's, the network theory. So the more users of a network, the more valuable it becomes, because there's the underlying utility cost, and our network is powered by T itself. So ultimately, the more people that we have building permissionlessly, utilizing some of the tools and some of the contracts that we're implementing, the more value is generated and the more is the need for the utility is greater. There will be things like distributing value, we think, in a fairer method, being able to distribute to, being able to understand what open source you use, say in your container or your enterprise environment, and then be able to distribute value to a tree of all the things, and not only the projects that you know of, but their dependencies and their dependencies, which we think will be very valuable for enterprise donation. But there will be other businesses built on top of it. And we imagine communication gating. We imagine that there might be different sorts of license mechanisms. We think that this is going to be a fantastic system for supply chain security, being able to understand the underlying assets and be able to depend on them, knowing that they're being funded reliably.
Yeah, see, that's a really, really interesting point you just made, and maybe we'll bring Max back in to comment on this. I'd mentioned I watched a webinar a couple of years ago from the folks at Tidelift, and the guy made a really, really interesting observation. He said, if you ask coders to describe themselves, most would not use the term supplier, but they really are suppliers and they're part of a supply chain. And this is a very long chain that has tremendous implications for running critical infrastructure all around the world. So in many ways, coders are, especially open source coders, project managers are suppliers in a supply chain, even if they don't kind of view themselves that way. I thought that was a very powerful observation that he made. And as I talk to you guys, I'm realizing that the depth of complexity necessary to achieve what you're trying to build, which is truly remarkable, and it is bulletproof. And that's the idea. It has to be bulletproof if it's really going to work. But what do you think about that supply chain analogy and how it kind of plays into what's really happening here?
Yeah, well, it's interesting, and I think the truth is a lot of open source devs do not consider themselves part of the supply chain and would
Right.
rather they weren't, right? They just want to make cool stuff, and like they love that other people think their stuff's cool and are using it and they're giving them feedback, and they dislike it when they get angry bug reports and things like that. And part of this is because they aren't getting paid, right?
Right.
Like, it kind of makes it so they don't have to really care.
Ha!
They don't
That's a
really
good
have to
point.
care if there's massive
Right.
security problems. Like they'd rather not, right? They're embarrassed
That's
about the
funny.
massive security problem. Like they're ashamed that their software had this bug that was problematic. But do they care if you've lost money? Nah. So part of that's just like a lack of responsibility that comes from not getting paid. So, we're building a valuable system that has utility that generates value inside of it, and then we're distributing part of that value to the open source devs.
Hmm.
They'll get some sense of obligation because of that, which makes them feel like they are part of this supply chain. And yeah, they don't have to do it, right? Maybe some of them will choose not to, right? They're fine with the situation as it is right now. But a lot of these 10% of projects that Tim was talking about that power so much of the world, they're kind of itching to get more flow coming in
Mm-hmm.
so that they can care more about their impact, so they can
Mm-hmm.
concentrate on security issues and bugs, on features,
Mm-hmm.
making sure that they have a wider distribution. And they're struggling to a large extent. Even huge projects like Python, right? They get funding from like lots of different companies. It's not enough. It's never enough. Like Airbnb donates something like 100 grand a year, and they're one of the biggest
Wow.
companies for donations to open source. And Airbnb make like $1 for every 1,500 bucks made worldwide. I think that was the stat last year or the year before
Hmm.
that was released. Um, it the way the system works currently doesn't encourage enough of that to go back. So
Right.
with what we're doing, we're hoping that not only does it like fix this injustice, which it's an injustice. It's not something, as I said, like none of us ever started open source in order to become rich. Like that wasn't why we did it. Like we don't expect like to make money with it. That we never did at least. But there is an injustice there, and like it should be fixed. But like what we really hope will happen is that we fix like this platform that powers everything into something that is more secure, is more reliable, is more robust, something that you can depend on more, rather than being the situation where you got Friday night deployment goes down because some open source package released like a bug. I did it yesterday. I released a bug. In one of my open source projects, like within 3 minutes, I had the bug report and I went and fixed it. But like, I, how much did I care? Not enough, because like that person's not paying me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I didn't care enough to have made sure that that particular issue wasn't going to get into production. You got to have the right incentives in place, even with something like open source.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point. And to your point, the incentive structure is just not aligned right now. And you have and that is one of the knocks on open source is that it'll get just good enough, and then it won't get further because there's no incentive to take it the next level. And that sort of last mile gets absorbed by the entities that sit on top of the open source projects, and they use that as the gravitational pull to sell big clients their technology and make a lot of money on it. And that's a very standard way of doing things. And it's interesting because the cloud has really democratized functionality to a large degree. Data is everywhere. We now have LLMs that can spin up code. You got the CEO of Claude saying, "Oh, in 2 years, 100% of the code is going to be written by AI bots." Personally, I don't believe that. I saw a rather amusing graphic where it said, "Okay, and 2025 is going to be 50%, 2026 is going to be 100%, 2027." Lots of engineers can make a lot of money fixing the bugs that AI embedded in the stack because it's really, really complex. And that's the thing. It's so complex that you don't really have full stack developers anymore. I mean, you could have someone who's pretty good, but to understand everything top to bottom is just it's darn near impossible. And it's even hard to do with teams, right? That's why you have these sprints, you have teams that focus on specific things and they're in this big stack. So there are all these factors kind of spinning around. What about, and we only got about a minute and a half left in this segment, but it seems to me that the bankers would care. It seems to me that big governments would care if they took a hard look at all this stuff. Real quick, maybe Max, bankers, government people, someone can step in and save the day here.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you'd think that the bankers and the people like that would say, no, we're not depending on open source. What are you crazy? We have 10,000 dependencies in this application and we're not paying any of them. They randomly break things all the time. Open source was insidious in how it became adopted by corporations, and now they're stuck with it. And the truth is, they can't pay 10,000 people, right? What you need is a system that makes it possible to pay those 10,000 people with like a simple donation
Interesting.
or service contract or whatever. People
Interesting.
have tried to build that, but they haven't really succeeded. It's one of the things that we also managed to do is that, like you can, as Tim was saying, like filter some of our T token through your entire dependency graph.
How interesting. This is really cool stuff. I'm dying to take a look at this thing, by the way, because the fact you have a dependency graph, to me, is the linchpin. Like that is the foundational technology you've figured out. Because then to be able to allow a company to do a sort of assessment and to, run a scan of their code basically and say, all right, where do we have issues in here? I mean, that's getting fairly sophisticated these days as well. So I'm beginning to understand how you will be able to monetize this in a meaningful way. And it's a very, very clever approach. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back talking about open source technology, the foundation of the cloud, basically, and of a lot of technology in the world today. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back on DM Radio. Eric Kavanagh here with Max Howell and Timothy Lewis of TEA. TEA.xyz is the website. And package maintainer burnout. We were just discussing in the break right there. And Timothy, I'll throw this over to you. Again, when you think about the criticality of certain applications of infrastructure that runs the cloud, that runs big businesses, insurance companies, healthcare providers, I mean, open source is everywhere. It's all over the place. A lot of times it's in places and people of import don't even know that it's there, don't even understand. So having a situation where your package manager is burning out because it's just too stressful and I can't get things done. I mean, that happens to data engineering teams all the time as well. Like it's a very, very serious challenge to understand, especially as we just are moving into this AI run universe to a certain extent. And I'm of course like most people fascinated by large language models. They are incredibly unwieldy. and they are not very reliable. In fact, we're doing a show next week on graph rag as a way to really moor these large language models. And a company called Data Squared is doing very interesting work there with Neo4j to ground these things. But the point is that you do have these giant stacks. And I don't know too much about the space, so I'm dying to learn more about it. But now you can do scans of code. And if I understand it correctly, you guys have a capacity to facilitate with this where a company could come along and say, all right, here's our code base. Where do we have dependencies? Where do we have problems? Can we map those out and prioritize them to know what to worry about, who to call when something goes wrong? I mean, all of these are very, very real questions to ask. Is that the kind of thing that you can facilitate with this engine that you're building? Maybe just kind of talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, the underlying engine will help with that. And as we get back into some understanding your own, the chain of supply dependencies that you have within your organization, we'll be able to help you identify how you can distribute value to them.
Hmm.
But I think that some of the problems that we were discussing, this burnout problem, that's been going on for a long time. You mentioned earlier one particular instance, you couldn't name it. I'm assuming it might have been the left pad instance that really wreaked havoc. But these things happen all the time. And I think with the proliferation of LLMs and the accessibility for more novice developers and vibe coders alike, which is amazing opportunities for people to help contribute in different ways. But it also adds to a lot of the noise that the package maintainers already deal with.
Right.
And as Max had
Right.
mentioned earlier, it's like, you likely have a job, and this is a job on top of a job, and this is the job that you're not getting paid for. Uh, and all of a sudden, if you have bug bounty systems where these LLMs are pointing out issues that if someone were to actually read the repositories and go through the code base, really isn't indicative of a problem. This just adds more noise to the communications that a developer has to, or a maintainer has to go review.
Right.
So these human in the loop package maintainers, we need to provide them some coverage.
Hmm.
So we need to make sure that they're incentivized to go through this stuff, as it sorts its way out. I mean, I'm a big proponent of LLMs for coding, and think things like RAGs and MCPs are really the direction that we need to head into to have more useful code from AI and develop that. But I just think that these LLMs will provide more open source, but it'll also provide more work for
Right.
those that are maintaining the packages to sort through and make sure that there really aren't any issues or problems with some of the things that they're suggesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is an excellent point. And yeah, I was reading the other day about the copy and paste phenomenon that's taking place now, and well, just another interesting story that Stack Overflow saw a 50% drop in traffic because people are just using ChatGPT to ask questions, and guess what? They're getting pretty good answers. I mean, what I try to remind people about with these large language models is that really they're consensus engines. So you have to remember that you're vectorizing text or imagery and then converting it back to text or imagery on the back end. That's a lossy process, first of all. But the second of all, when you train these things, the weights and the biases, what you're really doing is identifying patterns in text or patterns in visuals or even patterns in sound now with music and talking, for example, and replicating those patterns. Well, that's just going to give you the average of something. And if it's well published about, it'll be pretty good and pretty accurate. But it's very hard to tell what's accurate and what's not. Even if you look at the citations, if you follow down the wormhole, a lot of times the citations are either made up or inaccurate. And it's just like, all right, hold on, guys. Like what I mean, the whole thing kind of blows my mind. I'm a data guy, so we did a show a while ago where I talked about how in the whole history, and I'll ask maybe Max to comment on this, and then Tim. We only got about 5 minutes left in this last segment, but over the last 40 years, we focused on improving the speed and reliability of database technologies, with accuracy always being table stakes. Like, you will always get what you want, what you put in that database, you're going to get back. That's the whole point. But we worked on getting more concurrent users, all this stuff. And now with LLMs, all of a sudden we're throwing this noise filter on the end of that workflow where it's like, well, what are we doing? Are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater here? My point is that it's a very strange turn that we've taken here with these LLMs, and I'm not sure it's necessarily good, but you got to be careful what you do with these things. What do you think, Max?
Yeah, well, technology is always, is this going to be good or not? Like, you're never really sure. But one thing we technologists always do is we just jump in with both feet. And, like, it's inevitable that people are going to be writing a lot of code with LLMs over the next few years. Like, it's
Right,
just going to happen, whether or not you
right.
think it's going to be good or not. But one thing that I take solace with about it is that the AI always uses open source to build whatever it is you're telling it to build.
Oh, interesting.
Open source ain't going anywhere. However, the space in general is going. And if anything, like it's only probably going to make open source even more valuable. Like there was a study, I think it was last year, that said that open source is worth $8.8 trillion dollars. And if you start firing like, yeah, maybe mid-tier LLM devs at it, like it's only going to make open source even more important, even more
Yeah,
valuable. And those open source devs, yeah, they're going to get bombarded with bug reports and maybe adequate pull requests from these LLMs, and like they need to be enabled to continue working on this crucial infrastructure
yeah,
that not only do humans depend on, but now like machines depend on as well.
right. That's right. Yeah, machines depend on all this stuff too.
They're
This is
built with the open source components even, so like
right. Well, you're starting to see some bigger companies get religion. We did a show probably 3 years ago now where maybe longer than that actually. Some of the guests were joking that Amazon has been strip mining the open source communities is how they positioned it. And I've been told in the last couple of years that the corporate over there said, "Hey, you know what? We really should support this, whether by encouraging the developers to commit to open source projects. That's probably the number one way that they do. So we're paying them to do work, but they're working for open source. That's one of the ways to do it. But nonetheless, it is a vast ecosystem. I mean, it's just absolutely massive, and it's really important that we pay attention to this. So it seems that you have a very elegant solution you've designed here, which leverages Ethereum, leverages the blockchain, and contracts. You talked a lot about contracts. Maybe real quick, about 2 minutes here, Timothy. These contracts are pretty important for how you can use technologies or how you can use bits of code. Can you just very quickly talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, really, when you think about blockchains, especially like Ethereum, it is a series of different contracts and whatever they're used for, whether it's a simple token generation contract or a contract that have more elaborate rules on registry for different components in your ecosystem or exchange. So, these smart contracts have evolved over the last 10 years or so that they've been really developed, and we expect these types of execution layer contracts to become really important in understanding the supply chain and the provenance of a lot of the things that you're working with. So provenance in package management and package managers, really haven't been a priority.
Hmm.
Code itself generally hasn't been signed. Open source, something like
Right.
7% of open source is signed.
Hmm.
If we can start encouraging more people to use signed commits and then understanding the provenance of these packages, we can avoid some of the package injection techniques that people are utilizing.
Interesting.
And so, companies can be a little bit more secure and understand, the provenance of the software that they're using.
Yeah.
So that's the whole hope and goal. Contracts will, mitigate all of that and validate provenance for where how these packages have evolved and how they're
Yeah.
being distributed.
Like in the data world, we talk about data lineage. Where did this data come from? Can you trust this data, for example? Is it certified? Is it gold standard, silver standard? That kind of thing is what we're talking about for code and for packages to make sure that they work, to make sure you don't get all sorts of problems. Well, folks, podcast bonus segment is coming up in just one moment. We'll be right back. You're listening to DM Radio. All right, folks, back here on DM Radio, Eric Kavanagh talking to Max Howell and Timothy Lewis of tea.xyz. That's tea.xyz, building out a fascinating solution here to bolster open source and to foster greater trust. I mean, let's face it, trust is a crucial component these days in enterprise IT. And to think about so many of these technology stacks is that, when they break, really bad things happen. And so that's why it's important to understand dependencies, be able to evaluate your code, your entire code base, figure out where you have potential problems, try to get ahead of the curve a little bit. And Timothy Lewis, you mentioned that you guys have a big launch coming up any minute now. Tell us about that.
We do. This is our second test net. It's our final test net before going live on our main net. And this in particular allows people to get involved in the community, understand the operations of the T protocol, which is our incentive orchestration application, and learn how to register their repositories. On initial genesis, we'll have a wide distribution to these prior commits from open source. So there's a GPG funding that we're doing. So code commits over the last 20 years from the top 20% of all open source will be receiving a reward. So if you're listening to this and you've committed to a project that is a useful project in open source, you may want to come knocking on our door. So we're looking forward to rolling this out. The final testnet helps us resolve some of the Sybil attacks that we had faced, and we're really looking forward to getting this thing launched. But we have great communication going on in our Discord chat as well. But to check us out, just head to tea.xyz, tea.xyz, and look for the news that we're putting out. We've got a very active email group going. We have over 2.7 million emails that we are communicating with at this point, and a lot of active social channels as well. It's a lot of noise because there is a lot of Web3 activity, and anytime you involve Web3, there becomes a lot of people that are just interested in the economic benefits of the utility itself, which I think just shows how much people are interested in the potential value and funding of open source. But we really want to make sure that we connect and get through that noise to where the open source developers feel comfortable that we're trying to build something that is not only owned by them, but rewards them in their activity to try to make open source more secure.
Yeah. Well, and that is the key, right? Is we want software that works well, and we want software that is secure. And of course, the threat landscape is changing every single day. So what was secure yesterday may not be secure tomorrow. And I will throw out this comment, folks. What these gentlemen are saying is that if you've contributed to open source, to big projects, get your code registered, log on to tea.xyz. You can get some money. It's almost like the free money. Like, who gets free money? Like, these guys will, developers will, for work you've already done. I think that's a pretty clever way to get attention, because it's hard to get attention these days. And as you suggest, you mentioned Web3, you mentioned tokenization, mentioned crypto, and 80% of the country goes, "Oh my God, what is that even about anymore?" Some fun jokes on New Year's by a comedian about that. She was saying, you may have seen it on CNN. I can't think of her name, but she's like, "Has anyone noticed the timing here? That all of a sudden, when money starts falling in the hands of women, they're like, ah, sorry, money's over. We changed money." That was pretty good stuff.
You
But
know,
go ahead.
Sorry, the interesting part about crypto is it's not just these new token economies. We have these stable assets, so people will be able to receive USD on these types of networks. Really, the next evolution in crypto is these stable assets. I think over the next 3 to 5 years, transacting on these networks avoids a 30-cent charge that you have on every initial dollar from the credit card networks. So we're going to see a lot of these microtransactions go on networks like this, and we'll see a lot of large enterprises move into it. So it is more than just dog coins and memes. There is interesting technology that underlies where this is, and you don't even have to register to receive rewards in our protocol. If you have signed commits with GPG and you've been a part of a largely supported open source project, you may just have rewards waiting for you.
Yeah, that's pretty good stuff. So you've already done the work. You are a central part of the community de facto because you've already participated, and you guys are looking to help them. And then going forward, the idea is to have this engine be sort of an overlay that can be used by organizations to find their dependencies, to reward people who can fix problems, and really to kind of change the dynamics. And just last comments from you, Max. I think that the real push here is to bolster the open source community and keep the developers who do maintain these projects motivated, incentivized, and focused on continuing their work, right?
Yeah, well, indeed. Well, the history of open source is really very fascinating, and I look forward to the HBO documentary whenever they get round to it. But like it evolved very gradually into what it is now, and there's just so many heroes along the way who have made what we consider the modern world possible. Like you say, like open source is everywhere. It's on everybody's phone. It's been to Mars. It's on the bottom of the ocean. Like it has infiltrated every part of our lives, and like these people just thanklessly most of the time, like the most they can usually expect is abuse, and I can speak to that.
Yeah.
You get thanked occasionally, but this is our way of thanking them and trying to make something that really is more sustainable, more secure, more like it needs to be
Hmm.
going forward. So yeah, thanks for having us on. We really enjoyed this.
Absolutely. Look these gentlemen up online, Max Howell and Timothy Lewis, tea.xyz. I think it's a fantastic solution. I'm glad you guys are doing what you're doing. And I will thank you, and I'll thank all the folks in the open source community because open source keeps the world humming, folks. It really does. And we want to have as much solid, durable, resilient open source code available to build new cool things. And I like, I'll close on a comment Max said that every time you ask one of these LLMs to build something, it's using open source code. So that is in and of itself going to push more development and more attention on open source code. Send me an email if you want to be on the show, info@dmradio.biz. We'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to DM Radio.